This is Jennifer Gonzalez welcoming you to episode 229 of the Cult of Pedagogy podcast. In this episode, we'll be looking at a tiered system of strategies two teachers use together to provide just the right amount of support to all learners. The most important disclaimer about this episode is that it's not just for math teachers. The setting in which my guests and I have placed ourselves happens to be a math classroom, but we feel strongly that teachers of any subject will be able to take the strategies we talk about today and apply them in their own work. With that said, here's what we're doing today. I'm talking with two teachers, Sarah Riggs-Johnson, who is a learning and behavioral specialist, and Nate Wolkenhauer, who teaches middle school math. You might remember Sarah from episode 173, when she talked about how she collaborates with English language arts teachers to improve the writing skills of students with learning differences. Now she's back to talk about how she collaborates with a math teacher, Nate. In their working relationship, Sarah and Nate have developed a system of strategies that help all students learn better, a kind of pyramid where the strategies at the bottom apply to all students, the middle layers are used with a smaller group, and at the top are strategies that are only needed for a few students. They've written a blog post on Cult of Pedagogy that explains what every tier of this system looks like. If you teach math or special ed, this one is a must. But even if you don't, you're going to come away with some new ideas for how to help students who struggle, even if they don't have an identified learning disability. We had a hard time giving this one a title, and that's because it has so much good stuff that teachers can learn from. Here were some of my own personal takeaways. Number one, the collaborative relationship between Sarah and Nate is an excellent model for what effective co-teaching looks like. I know a lot of you work in partnership with other teachers, and I think there's a lot to be gained from observing the way Sarah and Nate respect and admire each other, how they recognize and make space for their individual strengths, and how comfortably they trade off taking the lead on instructional decisions. Number two, the school where Nate and Sarah work is independent, and that gives them more flexibility in how they work with students. The strategies shared here are most frequently used with students who have identified learning challenges, but Sarah and Nate also use them with any students who might benefit from them. I'm not well versed in all the laws that dictate what can and can't be done in public schools when it comes to special education, but I get the sense that they are more restrictive. My hope is that Nate and Sarah's more flexible approach might inspire public school teachers to open up more pathways for non-identified kids to still benefit from the wisdom of special ed teachers, assuming they're not already doing so. And finally, several of the strategies shared here might be considered a little unorthodox, like loosening the rules that have traditionally surrounded testing. I heard a couple of ideas for helping struggling students that I'd never heard of before, and they made sense. Nate and Sarah's number one goal is to help students learn and grow. If that means breaking a few small rules to get there, they'll do it. I love this spirit, and I hope some of their more creative approaches can find their way into other classrooms. Before I play our conversation, I'd like to thank Studio for sponsoring this episode. Studio is a planning tool which allows students to track and plan all of their classwork by estimating how much time a task will take and dividing larger tasks into smaller steps. This is a valuable tool to support parent conversations and help each student plan their work and pace themselves. Coaching students on better organization has a direct impact on their grades, as well as their long-term success. Studio offers a free plan that allows students and parents to view all Google Classroom assignments and allows teachers to post to Google Classroom directly from their schedule, as well as track student organization. School and district plans come with added features like centralized timetables, workload management, and more LMS integrations. Visit studio.co/pedagogy. That's studio.co/pedagogy to create your free account now and get your students planning. Support also comes from Scholastic Magazine's Plus. From social media to cell phones, getting your students' attention is harder than ever. That's why over 250,000 teachers use Scholastic Magazine's Plus to build student knowledge and skills. Every single story, video, and activity is written to excite your students and support evidence-based instruction. Available in print, online, or both, Scholastic Magazine's Plus connects the topics you're teaching to your students' lives. With new issues all year long, your students will read, think, and talk about what they're learning, even after class ends. With motivation like that, there's no telling how high you can raise achievement, and that's something we can all get excited about. Visit scholastic.com/magazines to learn more and use code 1234 to save 10% off the subscription of your choice. Now here's my conversation with Sarah Riggs Johnson and Nate Wolkenhauer about their tiered system of learning supports for all students. So Sarah, you have been on before, and you came to me a little while ago telling me about this work that you and Nate have been doing, and that basically you guys have come up with a lot of really great ways to support your students sort of as a collaborative team that you thought teachers could really benefit from. And so why don't we start by just talking about what exactly is your relationship in school? How do you work together?
Yeah, so I'm a learning behavioral specialist by title, or we call it an academic support counselor. But in Florida, it's an ESE teacher. There's like 8 million different titles, exceptional student education, and so and I'm one of two. And we work at a small independent school, and so my role is to just support students with academics. And because we're at an independent school, we kind of get to design how I do that. So we have kids that have support plans, learning profiles, sort of your equivalent to a 504 plan or an IEP. But we have kind of an open door policy where my partner and I decided we didn't want to do it that way. We wanted to support any student that felt like they needed it, or that did need it because their teachers feel like they needed it. And so what's really cool in that is also meeting with teachers, that I get to work with teachers closely. And when I recorded with you before, we talked all about writing and how English language arts teachers can collaborate with support specialists to enhance kids' writing. And I remember talking about it'd be cool to do the same thing with math. But at that point, I hadn't really collaborated to support kids in that way with math. And then we hired Nate, and we've done a lot of cool things to support students, but sort of organically. At no point did we sort of come up with this framework or model before even sitting down to think about it together to write this post for you. So
yeah. And so, Nate, you are a math teacher. What kind of math do you teach, and what's the grade level?
So I teach mostly pre-algebra and algebra. And I mean, I teach all pre-algebra and algebra. I teach mostly 7th and 8th graders. So there are a few 6th graders that are in my pre-algebra class, but pre-algebra, algebra. And Sarah has been wonderful. I've been at the school for 2 years, and we, I think, collaborate really nicely together. She comes into my room. We talk during planning periods. We work with a lot of the same students, and I think we both care for our students in the same ways. So I think that helps us as well to kind of be able to play off each other a little bit to make sure we're doing what's right for the kids.
Yeah. And so it's not, are you sort of assigned to be working together, or did it just sort of happened organically?
I work with the middle school. And so there are 2 other great math teachers we both work with. Our middle school is about 170 kids. So it's small comparatively to many schools, but also a lot of kids. And then, so not necessarily, but I try to work with all the middle school teachers and sort of thinking about students and meeting their needs, whether that's documented or not, sort of.
Okay. You guys have written a great post about all of these different things that you do to support your students in different ways. And one of the things that we talked about ahead of time is that we don't want people to think that these are just for math, because that will turn away everybody who doesn't teach math and they'll miss out on all of these great strategies. And they really are, I agree with you, none of them are math specific. So what you all have shared with us is basically a tiered system of giving students these extra supports to make them successful in your class, starting with the bottom layer where everybody gets it. And then as you move up toward the top of the pyramid, it's fewer and fewer kids who need and therefore get those extra supports. So all of these are things that you have sort of developed and refined together, like as a pair. Does that sound accurate?
Yeah. I mean, yes.
Yeah, I think the only thing that I would add is that I think a lot of teachers are doing these things already as well. Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't necessarily say that we developed them.
Yes.
Whereas I would say that we kind of maybe put it into words a little bit. But yeah, I don't want to, take credit for relationship building or, any of a lot of the things that we do. I think teachers are doing all over the country and the world. So
I got you. That's a really good, that's a good addition. And it sort of reminds me of the value of going to get my national boards, which I did a million years ago. But what I loved about that process was having to explain why I did the things that I did. And it kind of crystallizes those things. So yes, so these are not necessarily things that you all invented, but it's the way that they all kind of work together for you. That is what we're sharing. So let's go to this bottom layer on this pyramid. And we're doing this with a little graphic. So I will tell you what the bottom layer or what the layers are called, and then you all can start explaining them. So the very bottom layer that you all sort of use with everybody is what you're just calling no pressure relationships. Now, everybody talks about relationship building as an important aspect of teaching, but what do you mean by no pressure relationships?
Well, I think that when we say no pressure relationships, what we really mean is that we as teachers don't want the students to feel like they have to please us necessarily. It's okay for them to be themselves and to be emotional and to, when they're upset or angry, to talk to us about those things without feeling like we're going to hold a grudge or without feeling like we're going to be, upset with them when they are unable to control their emotions in those ways. One of the stories that we used in the article is about Sean, who is a student I taught years ago, who had some emotional behavior disorder issues. And I think that the relationship that we built helped him feel like it was okay for him to, come talk to me when he was feeling stressed out about something, or to reach out for help when he wasn't sure how to handle a situation. And I think that's really, really important for all kids to feel like they can have an adult they can go to and feel comfortable in that way.
And Sarah, with this post, a lot of these are things that you also added comments on. Some of these things that came from you and some sort of originated with Nate. And so what are your thoughts on this bottom layer of no pressure relationships?
It's essential. I mean, Nate does it so well. And I feel like I'm going to embarrass him for the next hour by just talking about what a great teacher he is. I mean, he's going to get uncomfortable, but that, I don't think, Nate, you go into it thinking about sort of what it does for kids' brains. Like that's kind of where my mind is all the time in terms of how kids learn and the sort of psychological, but also the cognitive research that backs this stuff out. But it's how you feel in school affects how you learn in school. So just feeling like, and there's so much research even pointing towards if a kid has one adult in the building that they feel connected to or they feel they can talk to, that is the biggest predictor of their psychological health and success going forward. And then in the work that I do to support students who are struggling, it's also really important because, we work with middle schoolers and 12-year-old boys don't like talking about things that they feel vulnerable about. failing a test or not doing well grade wise or struggling with reading, is something that's hard to kind of admit to and talk about. And so kind of getting to know them in a different way, what their strengths are, what their interests are, is sort of a way in to that. So we talk about, sometimes we do research on kids' interests because you have to. Like, I don't know anything about anime, but there's so many kids that are into it that we've read up and been able to ask questions and connect with them in that way around stuff they're interested in. It makes it easier then to talk about the math.
That's where I was going to head with that next, is that you're seeing this then transfer into their academic performance.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that like as Sarah was saying, it's so much easier to have a conversation about something more difficult when you're already comfortable. And so if, we're able to kind of start a conversation and talk about the basketball game or talk about something that, Brawl Stars or whatever the game the kids are playing at the, each month or week, however often it changes. If we start with that, then we can kind of work into the math. Like, okay, now we've kind of had this conversation. We're both comfortable. We're feeling good. Let's talk about this thing. Let's look at this problem, or let's look, how are you feeling with this?
Yeah. And, a lot of you all write about this too at various places in the post about how kids, by the time they get to middle school, they really do start to develop this identity around math, which can be oftentimes very negative and very much sort of like, I'm not a math person, and that blocks them from being able to learn more. And so part of this bottom tier that's so important is just establishing that comfort and safety emotionally, which will then allow them to take more of those academic risks, ask for help, admit they don't know something, try, as opposed to just kind of shutting down. And it sounds like you saw that, Nate, with that student Sean, and I'm assuming you've probably seen it with plenty others since then too.
Yeah, absolutely.
So once we've got that bottom layer of just kind of making everybody comfortable, establishing these relationships, not putting a lot of pressure on that, and the anime comment too it's really valid, because there's this strategy I remember learning about years and years ago called the 2x10 strategy, where you've got, if it's a kid who's just sort of a problem, and for 10 days in a row spend 2 minutes talking about anything but school. Yeah. And I remember always thinking, what happens after the 10th day? But I think it's just a way to build that habit and take the pressure off of your behavior, your academic performance, whatever it is, and just have a regular relationship. And that really reminded me of that when you were talking about this whole idea of just not putting a lot of pressure on performance all the time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's harder to do, right? Like, you do need to kind of focus on, okay, this kid's a little bit hard to talk to or hard to get to open up. So
yeah,
I like that strategy for that reason. It's like, I can do that for 2 minutes though.
And I think the other thing that Nate mentions in the post too is this whole idea of like removing our own ego from the situation, so that if the kid rejects you on a certain day, says, no, I just don't really want to hang out and talk right now, that's fine. That's part of being the adult in the situation, and not, getting hurt about it and making it, putting it on them to maintain this relationship, that you're just there when they're ready. And I think that has them come toward you a lot more.
Yeah, I think so as well. I think you described it really well there about what that no pressure relationship means. Like you don't want the kids to have to feel like they need to worry about you.
Right.
You're there for the kids, and that may mean that you're giving them space and stepping away and letting them, think on their own. And I think that's really important to remember, that kids aren't always ready to talk. Kids aren't always don't always need to talk, don't always want to talk. So it's okay to give them that space and let them grow on their own a little bit, and then you're there for them as they need.
Yeah. I think teachers make a lot of our worst teaching decisions, our worst disciplinary decisions, when we get our feelings hurt by students. And then all of a sudden our own egos come into play, and then we end up doing things that we regret later. So okay, so that was the bottom tier. Next level up, we are calling this stand on your chair. So Nate, explain what that means.
Sure. So, well, I'll explain that example in a moment. But I think the stand on your chair title basically means that we want the kids to expect the unexpected and to have fun at school and to understand that math doesn't have to be this awful thing where you're given a paper and you have to sit in your desk and you know write down all your work in pencil as you're trying to figure things out. We want kids to know that it's something that can be fun, it's problem solving, it's something that is different. And one of the things that I try to do in my classroom is encourage the kids to be excited, and to, again, I know I mentioned this already, but expect the unexpected. And so when I say stand on your chair, this is something that I actually learned from the Ron Clark Academy in Atlanta, Georgia. And one of the things that he allows the kids to do is to stand up on their chair when they're speaking. What I tell the kids is that this is, giving them some experience talking in front of a crowd. It gives them experience kind of presenting themselves well and standing upright and, catering to their audience. I also teach them to be looking at who they're talking to. One of the main mistakes not mistakes, but one of the things that the kids do often is when we're starting out is they'll look at me, they'll stand on the chair and then they'll look at me. Like, you're not talking to me, you're talking to everybody else.
Yeah.
So that's something that they kind of, get better and better at the more that we do it. But the real reason that I'm having them stand on their chair, or a big portion of the reason I have them stand on their chair, is because it's something that is different that they are not used to at school. It's something that they feel is a little bit taboo. Like, oh, I can stand on my chair and put one foot on my desk while I'm presenting this thing or talking about this thing. It kind of gives it this cool aspect, I guess you'd say.
Yeah.
And so I think that's where the kind of stand on your chair it comes from. It really is just a way to get kids engaged and excited. And I also realized that when I started doing that, I'd have more kids willing to stand up and engage and participate in the discussions that we were having in class.
What you're talking about is this concept of sort of novelty also. Like whenever you introduce some novel element into a teaching experience, kids are more likely to remember it. It's going to stick in their memory. I've even heard this idea that if you have somebody stand in a different part of the room when they're learning something, then when they go to take the test, their eyes are going to go to that corner because they're just trying to pull it out of their long-term memory. So you're creating a lot of those things. But then you also talk in the post about purposeful movement, attaching that to math concepts, which again can be used with any kind of content at all. So how does that work in your class?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're moving kind of constantly. Sometimes it's something as simple as, we're working in groups up on the board. And so instead of sitting in their chairs, the kids are up with markers, writing on the board, working out problems, talking together. It could also be something like hand motions. So something that we do for every chapter is we have vocabulary for different math terms. So for example, unit rate is one of the terms that we teach the kids. So the kids actually come up with hand signals as groups. And then we kind of vote on a consistent one that we'll all use. So the kids are engaged in that process of, okay, let's think about what this word means. What is a hand signal that we could, match to that word and that definition? So unit rate is just like this. And a unit rate again but a unit rate is something where it's a fraction where you're simplifying it to be over one, basically.
And so when they start to do that after a while, it clicks.
And that's something that I'm doing constantly in class as well. Anytime I say the word unit rate, I say, show me unit rate. So the kids are, we're doing unit rates, talking about it. I was like, all right, show me unit rate. And they'll go like this. And if they're not sure, they might look around, which is fine. It's that reinforced action that then when they're getting to the test, they see the word unit rate. We want them to make that connection in their head. Oh, that's what unit rate is. Okay, that's what this means. And then kind of work from there.
Yes, absolutely. And I think in any class from kindergarten through, medical school, you could be attaching gestures to all kinds of different vocabulary and just making those connections better.
Absolutely.
Music also. Nate has guitars in his classroom, in his math classroom.
And do you pull the guitars out and play them?
I
Yes, he
do. Yep.
does.
Do you
We
have songs associated with the math?
do have songs associated with the math. Yep. And sometimes that means that I'm, giving the kids lyrics and we're talking about what those lyrics are, and then we're playing the song and singing together. Sometimes that means that I'm giving the kids lyrics and saying, why don't you create something and record yourself with these lyrics? And if you want to change the lyrics, feel free to change the lyrics. So again, I would say that those music and movement, I think, are connected in a lot of ways. And a lot of the same parts of the brain are being activated with music versus and movement.
I feel like we can't move on if we don't talk about the grocery store and the Quadrant Quest. So let's talk about those two games. Well, sorry, one is more of a simulation and then one is more of a game, because we've got some photos that we're going to include in the post. So we should mention them here too.
Of course.
What's the grocery store thing that you do?
So grocery store actually was about unit rates as well. So we're using a lot of unit rates in this example. So the kids, we taught them they came up with the hand signals first. We kind of reinforced that at the beginning. And this is actually all happening in the hub. And Sarah mentions this in the post as well, that at our school, we have a area called the hub that's kind of outside of the classrooms, where we can pull the kids out and do lessons there as well if we'd like. So we were kind of reinforcing in the hub. My classroom door was closed. And when I opened it up, the kids heard, nice piano music that they'd hear in a grocery store. And all the desks are set up with food all over. Our school was doing a food drive at that time. So I kind of just borrowed all of the food from the food drive and stacked it all up and made it look like a grocery store. We actually even had pictures of our head of school and our assistant head of school as the manager and assistant manager in Publix. And Publix is the grocery store that we have here in Florida.
Yeah.
So the kids basically would go in small groups, and they would rush to find two items that are the same item but different brands. So for example, grade A eggs versus Publix eggs. And the cost for those, and eggs probably wasn't the best example, but the cost would be per egg. So the kids would look,
tiny part of the price tag. That's it. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. Right. So it's like we've got a dozen grade A eggs or 2 dozen Publix eggs. They've got to figure out what the better example is. So they run in, they grab the items, and those are just printed out papers with the eggs on them and the prices. And then they bring them back out into the hub and they work on creating those unit rates, comparing them. And then they keep the one that is cheaper and bring the other one back and put it back into the store, like return it basically.
Yes. And that gives them a real world experience. It gives them a lot of movement again. And so then what about Quadrant Quest? What is that?
So Quadrant Quest is a game that we used to teach the 4 quadrants and graphing, so ordered pairs. And the way that game worked is I put the kids into groups of 4-ish. We then kind of had a team that was on the board and teams that were off the board. And if the teams that were off the board, they would still be plotting all of the points that are happening on the game. Just so I'm thinking about teachers, using a game like this, it's important, I think, for the kids that are not on the board to be doing those same reinforcement activities while they're working. So the kids that were on the board would get a stack of ordered pairs that would be upside down, and they would take turns starting at the origin or at 0-0. And the person on the board would stand, and their teammates would have to describe exactly how to get to the whatever the coordinate was. So this is teaching them that, if it's negative on the x-axis, we're going to the left. If it's positive, we're going to the right. If it's negative on the y-axis, we're going down. If it's positive, we're going up.
Right.
So those kind of important pieces of plotting points. And they'd try to get through as many as they could. If they got to the right spot, they'd then put it down and the next person would come up. And I think they had 60 seconds to get as many of them as they could. And again, the kids off the board are still plotting.
Right.
The kids on the board are trying to get as many as they can. And then they rotate, all the groups kind of rotate in and have that opportunity.
Just making it, again, physical so that they remember it a lot better. Sarah, as a special ed specialist, what are your thoughts on all this movement and novelty and everything?
I'm glad you used the word novelty, because that's, I think, part of it. Novelty and movement, but also like context and meaning and play. So math isn't very meaningful for a lot of students. You get the question about like, why do I need algebra? I'm never going to use it. And so it just brings them more context in terms of understanding real math, but also they enjoy it. And I think in that sense, like I've had so many kids or parents say that math feels totally different once they get to pre-algebra with Nate, that they used to hate that class and they really start to like it. And I think there's also this idea that I don't know, teenagers, pre-teenagers, adolescents don't need to have fun at school, or that in some way denotes a lack of rigor. And I like that doesn't play out in any research I've ever seen. Like I feel like it actually then is when you get them to sort of rise to more rigor, and it does. Like eventually they take a test on this and they have to learn how to do it on paper and how to solve problems, but it gives them sort of more motivation to learn it.
Yeah, that was always I was middle school. That was my age group. And they loved anything, any kind of getting up out of their seat to do. Sometimes they would push you. The 8th graders in particular, they're a little more like high schoolers, and it's like, but you get them over that hump. And a lot of times they can get into it and they get excited when they get answers right. And absolutely.
I think you're saying getting over that hump is important and a good way to say it, because a lot of times I'll be like, all right, everybody stand up, and then you get a couple of I'm like, oh, come on. Like, you know you're going to love it because it's going to be great. Yes. So it really is just getting them over that little, like, okay, nobody's looking at me. Like, everybody's doing this. I'm doing it. I'm a little bit eccentric.
That's the key too. If you're willing to be like the dork first, then a lot of them they will fall in line and try it. Sarah, you also mentioned something too about neurodiversity and how this fits into this whole piece.
Yeah, where kids need different ways to sort of engage in tasks. Sitting in a chair all day, every day, we know that doesn't work, and we still make kids do it a lot. So I think it helps a lot of students who just need more movement, who need more context, who need to do it in a different way or write it out or something else to be engaged in the lesson. Because if not, you're not really going to get them. They're going to be passive or be thinking about their video game while they try to take notes and get maybe half of it down. We know that's what happens.
So we're still in the bottom of the pyramid, where these are things that we are doing with pretty much everybody. And so the next part of that, we're still in this bottom, is what you call my job, not your job. What is that?
So that really builds on the relationship building, I feel. My job, not your job, basically is and the reason we call it that is because that's something that I say in my classroom, and the kids kind of start to repeat that as we're working through the year. But my job, not your job, basically means that I, as the educator, if there's an issue, I'm going to take care of it. And it doesn't matter who the student is. It doesn't matter, if it's who the kids consider to be a good kid. And basically, I'm going to have these same expectations for everyone. And I don't need the kids to try to handle those situations, because typically that doesn't help. And to just give you an example with what I mean by that, if a kid says something, talks back to another student, the other student talking back to them isn't going to solve the problem.
Mm.
Whereas if I say, hey, I need you to, like, that's not appropriate, we're not going to talk like that. I'm the one handling it, and the kids have to trust me to be able to be that one that's going to handle it.
Yeah.
And a lot of times what happens is I'll say, Sarah, that's not appropriate. Let's move on from there. And then Jen will kind of snicker or say, yeah. And in that situation, that's when I'm saying, hey, that's my job. It's not your job. Like, let me do my job, but you're not helping by adding this extra pressure or
Right.
Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Ridicule, yeah. I mean, the way that you describe it too is just sort of that you don't want anybody teasing or picking on each other, even if it's
Exactly.
for a good reason or justified. That sort of shutting all of it down creates this baseline of respect between everybody.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that the kids, they really get that. And again, they start to catch themselves, and they'll say, like today, for example, I had a kid say, oh, that's your job, not my job. They start to say, like, oh, okay, you're right. I shouldn't have said what I just said, and I'm going to call myself on it. So it's this kind of accountability piece, I think, for the kids.
How does that impact their learning of math?
Well, I think that it creates this safe environment for the kids. So I have students that are fine to talk about what their thinking is, even if they aren't sure what the answer is. And they're comfortable saying, okay, I think this is the answer. And if they're incorrect, they know that there's not going to be, like, there's no judgment there. The other kids, we're all kind of working and talking together. And oftentimes I'll praise that student as well. Like, I'm so glad that you took that risk and you talked about that. Like, and I really like your thinking there. Like, you connected this and this. Who has thoughts about that thought? So we're kind of turning these, conversations as they should be into learning experiences where the kids are kind of figuring out together and helping each other.
Right. And that sort of communicates to them that whatever their thought process is, it's got some value. It's not about, you got it right, and therefore you get to be a part of the conversation. Yeah.
And I think that's a common thing in math is, there is a right answer. And so kids focus more on the answer than they do on the process. And, with the my job, not your job kind of attitude, I'm trying to instill that the process is important. And it's okay to take risks, and it's okay to make mistakes. And we're going to talk about those things and eventually get to where we need to go. But you're getting there by taking those risks and making those mistakes.
Sarah, you introduced this idea of chasing the tigers out of the classroom, which comes from somewhere else.
I would say it's not my idea.
How does that connect to what Nate's doing with his kids?
Just that students, even, not necessarily even students with learning differences, but students bring a lot of anxiety into the classroom with them about how they're going to perform on the test or answering a question, in front of their peers. And then I think there's those personalities that it doesn't matter if you have the best lesson in the world planned. If something goes wrong, or there's a kid worried about what this kid is thinking and what that kid's going to say after I give my answer, they don't benefit from it. So the Tigers idea comes from Allison Posey's work and in UDL and research about how if you feel that anxiety, it's the same response in your brain as if there were a tiger in the classroom. You can't process, you can't think. It's just fight or flight or shut down is more sort of socially acceptable. So starting the year with that, laying out the expectations, and he really kind of role plays it with them in a way because I think, like you said, when a teacher gets their feelings hurt, that tends to be how we don't respond in the best way. Or when they when you just feel that heightened emotion. But then when the kids all know what to expect, I think it shuts down a lot of that kind of one-upping and each other that they do. And even when it doesn't, at least it's consistent and it's a safety net. They know exactly what they should and shouldn't do in that classroom, and everyone can kind of exhale then and take risks and answer questions and try to learn.
We're going to move to the next tier, which we are calling high expectations, flexible means, which is also a phrase that you're saying comes from Katie Novak's work.
Yes, okay. It comes from Universal Design for Learning, and Novak Education, and it's just the idea that kids need to be held to high expectations. And I think about it in terms of how I help support students, that I'm not trying to modify the standard or the concept or sort of over help them, because they need to know this to move on to high school math. They need to understand this, but we might think about how they need it differently, or how they need to show what they know differently than other students. And that's the flexible means part.
So you have an example of a student that we're calling David here, so we can see what this actually looks like in an example. So tell me about what you decided to do with David to illustrate this idea of still having the same expectations, but finding a different route to get there.
Yeah, so David is a student we've both taught for several years now, and he has dyslexia, pretty severe dyslexia. Which impacts him in math, because math is a symbol system, is a language, just like reading in English. So when you get to algebra, especially, all the symbols change, sort of, where an X used to mean multiplication, now an X means this unknown quantity, and there's all these new ways to express multiplication and all the different operations. So there are students like him that really, he understood the sort of process for getting to the right answer, like the concept, but he was bombing tests because he just, added something, missed a negative sign, little calculation errors, things that I would sort of expect, just knowing that patterns and even just spelling really regular words was really difficult for him. So it made sense that he just sort of would miss a negative sign and get the whole problem wrong, kind of thing. So rather than just kind of letting him fail in that way, Nate and and my partner actually worked with him as well, because I also taught at the same time he took math tests, but we worked with him to do some more error analysis. And instead of just turning in the test and bombing it, we would review it first to a certain degree and then see if he could recognize his own errors. So, I want you to look at number 6 and number 13 and number 21 and look closely at your negative signs. And so that sort of did several things. It helped his grade, but that wasn't sort of the main point. It also helped him learn that he needs to do that. He needs to go back and check and revise his work and look over those tiny details, because that is where he is always sort of going to struggle with math. So we kind of try to teach him a process for doing that. I should also mention that he's like an unbelievable kid, just so sweet, works so hard. And so he's the kind of kid that teachers, I just had this happen today, actually, teacher want to say, I'm just going to throw him some extra points. I don't want him to fail. He came and met with me. We went over the content. And so it's hard to kind of hold the line between, like, is that really going to be good for him in the long term? Yeah. He's got to learn to do this, and he needs, to make the grades he makes and to revise his work. And
I don't think we talk about this enough. Like, I don't think we really ever talk about this. I can remember even teaching a pre-service teacher who was an excellent student, worked so hard. And I remember her turning in a paper And I barely looked at it, and I was just like, oh, it's probably fine. And I looked at it
Yeah.
again later, and I thought, she did this completely wrong. She's going to
Yeah.
have to, but it's because we already had such a good relationship. And I started just, and we really do our kids a huge disservice. We've got to be careful about those kids that we have a great relationship with, because we can sometimes let kind of fudge things, and then we create these gaps in their skills and knowledge.
Yeah. Well, that, and kids that have a true learning difference, they always say that if you sort of reinforce the idea that you don't think they can do it when you don't hold
Yeah.
them to a high expectation, instead of working with them to find a way that they can do it, so
You would he would turn this test in, and you would sit back down with him and say, hold on.
yeah.
I want you
Now
to,
we're
and so
going to do
instead
the
of just
check
either
over.
marking them off or just giving him the points, it was this
Yeah.
thing in between.
I think that another point to just say is that we're helping him use the accommodations that he has, and so we're not only teaching him those skills of like, what do I do in this scenario? What do I like when I'm done with the test? I should review it, and that's going to help my grade. But also, I think that Sarah's unbelievable at working with students and helping them understand that accommodations are there for a reason, and they're good, and you should use your accommodation. You should be confident about using your accommodation. So I think that in David's situation, we helped him, or really Sarah helped him know when the appropriate time is to ask for an accommodation and how to ask for that accommodation, and to be confident in what you're doing, or I guess confidence not the right word, but comfortable in asking for those accommodations.
Yeah. One thing that I think really stands out about the approach that the two of you have sort of evolved into together, that is, I think, kind of different, is you have really taken away a lot of you've taken testing off of the pedestal, in terms of like, it's not this hallowed ground that we can't touch. You guys have kind of like allowed the testing environment, and I don't mean standardized, I mean you giving a test in your class, to be still a place where there can be some discussion, there can still be some learning, which I think is just, of everything that you've shared, I think it is probably the thing that is the newest to me, in terms of me not really hearing it in other places. And I think it's just, I don't know, I think if there's any takeaway, that probably is going to be the one that people go, oh, I've never thought about doing that. I didn't know you could do that. And, it really gives a completely different opportunity for learning for different kids. So let's move to the fifth tier. The fifth tier we are calling learning out loud. And, we're already getting the sense, Nate, that your classroom is not a quiet space. So, but you take it, again, this kind of goes into the testing environment. We already know that it's very active and very busy, and students are talking, but how does this actually translate into like a testing environment?
Well, I think that, again, conversation is very important when you're learning, and especially working with others. You want to be able to explain your thinking. You want to be able to get from point A to point B and verbalize how you're doing that. So first of all, if you are working with someone, you can explain those steps, but also, so in your own head, you have to understand that math isn't always the same 4 steps. Like, you're going to have to understand what the problem's asking you. You're going to have to understand, if you're in a real world situation, when the tax is going to be added and when the discount's going to be taken off. So it's not always the same, like, you're going to get from here to here in this way. You might have to go in a way that's different from the norm. So I think that talking things out is really important in the classroom. And oftentimes when the kids get to the tests, they struggle with having to be silent and translate all those conversations into, now, oh, I have to work in my head. And so I think Sarah does a really, really, really good job with letting the kids come in and just talk through things. There's students, individual students as well, that need that a little bit more than others. That they need to be able to verbalize what they're saying and what they're thinking. And it doesn't mean that Sarah or I are giving them answers by any means. We're just letting them read the question out loud. And when they say, so slope intercept form is y equals mx plus b, we're encouraging them to keep going, as opposed to, you know.
So is that what it looks like? I mean, when you're talking about kids will come to, so this is not a child who is in the middle of class talking out loud through a test. They go to Sarah
Correct.
in a quiet office and you let them kind of talk through, and there's a little bit of prompting, correct?
Sometimes, yeah,
Okay.
sometimes it's literally me making that face of like, yes, I think that might be slope intercept form. But they just are sort of used to hearing themselves say it. So sometimes I'll say like, I'm just going to be over here. You do whatever you need to do. I have a stand-up desk, so some kids like to stand. And if it helps you to read problems out loud or talk through them, or even, and then some of them will ask me like, am I setting this up right? And it sort of depends on the student, how much validation I give them. There are some students that really, that's like all they want is just someone to say like, am I on the right track? And I give them a little of that and then try to pull back on it later as they get more comfortable taking tests. But, math tests are difficult because you've got all these different kinds of problems grouped together, and I think kind of giving, and we'll talk about that more about this more when we talk about test polling, but giving them some direction and like, have you seen a problem like this before? I think, they start to go, oh yeah, this is when we did, unit rate or whatever in class.
Yeah.
Or one we sang a song about, and then kind of take it from there. And it's obviously it's like we're privileged to have the space and the time, and sometimes I don't have as much space as other times to let students do that, but we kind of make my support office and then my partners a space where kids can do those things and use those kinds of accommodations if it helps you to talk during a test.
Is that, I'm thinking back to IEPs and 504s that I have seen in the past. And I remember hearing you've got somebody who can read out loud for you. You can get a scribe. But this one, did you guys just kind of figure this one out on your own? Like I
think so.
Yeah.
Like kids that would just do better when they talked. I don't know. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Like we have a student, we talk about him in the post, Eli, he just needs sensory stimulation to focus and exist. And he's the kind of kid that will sit there with the test and be on problem 2 40 minutes into it because it's not that he doesn't know how to do it. He's thinking about like, what's the biggest number in the world? Or he's like seeing how many digits can I get into this calculator?
But he knows the math.
Yeah, but he knows the math, but he needs like constant next problem, next problem, next problem. And so for him, talking through it just helps him stay focused on it.
Yeah.
And like I am kind of explicit with him about that and getting him to understand that that's the strategy that you need to use to get through this math test because it's working. Point to the formula you're going to use and then talk me through what you're doing. And I don't need to even say anything to him. He knows what he's doing. He just needs that much sort of sensory stimulation to keep going and not get distracted from his work.
It sounds like it's really customized for each kid in terms of you get to know them, and that's the relationship piece. You get to know them. You figure out exactly how much little bit of scaffolding they need. I have 2 questions about this. Number 1, I'm going to ask them both so that I don't forget the second one. And then you can answer them both in your own time. But the first one is, do you notice over the course of a year that some of these students that you give these supports to, that they need them less and less, or do they have a constant need? So that's the first one. Second question is, are these available to kids who do not have an identified learning disability?
I think for the first one, it depends on the student. I definitely see students, though, get more confident at taking tests in general. And then sometimes like they decide they don't even need to come up anymore and they're just going to stay in the classroom, or they feel more I'm just going to ask Mr. Wolkenhauer my question if I have one. And, then for others who maybe need it for a different reason, like staying focused, it's something they might continue to use, and we might refine or write into their accommodation plan is what we call it, as they get older, and try to find ways for them to keep doing that. I think, as they get older, sometimes it becomes like less something they want to do, but they grow and change and adapt out of accommodations and strategies all the time.
I would say too that there are kids that will take a test in math and struggle, and then will try this talking out loud accommodation, and they'll do really well. They'll be really successful, and they feel that success. And then the next time they take it, they're already kind of in this confident mindset of, okay, I can do this. This thing worked. Like, let's keep building from there. And so, again, I think you're right, Sarah, that it depends on the kids. But I do think that the confidence piece is important, and letting kids understand that you can be successful in math. And sure, maybe you need to talk while you're doing your test, but you're a smart kid. Like, you know what you're doing. You've got this. So I think that's important to add.
It seems like it would also really build their own ability to self-advocate as they get older, especially this is such an important age for them to start being able to articulate, this is what I need to be successful, and then be able, as they leave your classroom and move on to other grades, to be able to communicate that with future teachers. And if those teachers are open to it, to just understand how their own brains work is so valuable.
Yes. Yeah, no, and that's part of it. And then your question about, do students who don't necessarily have accommodations use it? Sometimes, like, we will, I'm careful about, I don't want to give them something that I know they're not going to have or qualify for in the future, but also they're just in middle school, and we get a lot of time to work with them as they sort of grow up. So if we feel like, we had a student that, Nate, you felt like this would, I think, really help him, but he's not a student that would normally see me or work with me, try it. And then it did help him to talk out loud. And so the nice thing about sort of having this open door policy, as we say, is then the conversation can go from there in terms of, if this is something that needs to continue, then maybe it's worth having some conversations about whether accommodations might help that student or not. And sometimes, we have families that are like, well, we'd rather, I don't know. We do it all. We work with them all.
Yeah. I mean, that's why I asked, because I remember the frustration of having a student who I felt maybe would qualify, but there was some reason, maybe they were just on the cusp, or the family didn't really want to do that, or so. And you're like, but they do need this extra help. And so
right.
I think it's great that you're able to kind of fill those gaps in and maybe at least teach them some strategies.
It's hard when that whole, like, it comes with that whole process, and then people feel differently about labeling kids and having to get this diagnosis just to get something that we already know would help them in school. Yeah. So that's where I like being able to kind of throw out the rules on that one, and just do things that we already know would help a student, and then we'll worry about what comes next later. I don't know.
And I will say too that we, like in the example that Sarah was just using, the student that didn't have the accommodation that we thought, well, let's try it. We are having open communication as well with the student, but also with the parents. Like, we're talking to the parents and saying, hey, this is something that we want to try. And depending on whose relationship is better, whether it be Sarah's relationship with the parent or my relationship with the parent, that person will call and say, hey, this is something we want to try. What do you think? And oftentimes they'll say, yeah, that's great. Let's give it a shot and let's see what happens. I think that the parents need to know that we're in it for the kids. Like, we want the kids to be successful, and we want them to learn, and we want them to be happy and confident where they are. And so when we're suggesting these things to try, it's, it is for the kids.
Yeah. So let's move to tier number 6, which we're calling it test pulling. And we're still in this realm of like taking away all of these like fancy taboos around testing and like making it more of a learning opportunity. So Nate, you start with a story in this section about your own experience cheating on a test. So tell us a little bit about that experience and what that has to do with what we're going to talk about next.
Sure. So yeah, when I was in high school and some social studies class, I did not prepare myself appropriately for a test. I don't remember why, but I was not ready for it, and I opted to cheat, which is, again, something I'm happy to talk about because I think that it's good to know that, yeah, teachers sometimes make those decisions as kids too, and I got caught, which is good. I'm glad that I got caught cheating. And the thing that really, the reason I tell that story and the reason that I talk about that is because I felt this kind of anxiety in not being prepared. And I think that when kids do feel unprepared, they kind of have this scale where they're weighing, okay, is the cheating worth it? I don't want to have this embarrassment of doing poorly on an assessment or on a test. And in my scenario, it's because I didn't prepare appropriately. But I think it's important for teachers to understand that some kids are feeling that kind of all the time of like, oh, I don't think that I'm ready for this, or I don't think that I'm prepared, even if they are. And so, again, I think that the big point here with this is for teachers to be aware of that feeling and to be aware of those anxieties that kids have, and how do we combat those feelings and those fears.
So yeah, all kids come to us with, or not all, but some kids, test anxiety is a real debilitating thing. And so, Sarah, you started doing this thing that you started calling pulling for certain kids during tests. What does that look like?
It's it kind of came from a girl that we were trying to work with who Nate had, she failed. I mean, everything, all her tests and quizzes, and she really struggles with math. And it just was sort of like, what's the point of just kind of keeping her in this? And I also was struggling to find time to work with her on math because when kids come to see me after school at the end of the day, they're tired. She especially was done after a whole day of school and just couldn't. It's not what they want. It's not what they want to be doing, is focus on your hardest subject for the next hour. And so we thought, I think, Nate, you suggested that maybe she should just take her test with me and I can sort of help her through it and see and then I could sort of see where the breakdown was more for her and why she was struggling with math. And so through that, and then we started doing it with some other students and even some of the other math teachers I work with started sending me students, and students come to take tests with me anyway because of needing more time, needing a quieter space, having test anxiety about, my friend is turning her paper in and I'm only on problem 3, and then I freak out and I go blank and I can't remember what I studied. So there's lots of reasons why I think the accommodation of going to a separate space can help students with math tests. But this is a little bit more. This is sort of me. And I explained to them, it's a test. I cannot give you answers or reteach how to find volume. That was something that, you guys have been working on with homework for a week. But what I will try to do is kind of pull out what you remember, what you know from class and from what you practiced. And so I do that by asking a lot of questions, by looking at the test with them and making them kind of zoom in on, like, what is this question actually asking for? What information does it already give you? Do you know how to at least set it up? And then I'll kind of try to get at too, is there like a disconnect in the wording of the question and what they understand? So I'm just trying to sort of pull it out of them. And a lot of, like, I think I say in the article, 90% of kids don't need really much more than that. And then they have this like, oh, wait, I remember. Oh, we did a problem like this one on the homework. Yep. And they kind of get themselves to a place where they can at least solve part of the problem. And we talk a lot about that. Like, can you can you at least set the problem up? Can you, and then it also models for them sort of a routine for what to do when you're
Mm-hmm.
stuck or when you're
Mm-hmm.
in this anxious moment, instead of just sort of leaving the whole test blank and letting them fail,
Mm.
which happens, all the time with students.
Yeah.
It just made sense to kind of have an intermediate step where you're scaffolding a little bit, um, but not, not giving them answers or.
I'm imagining somebody listening to this right now who is resisting this
Yeah,
and thinking it's not fair. It's not fair. This is supposed to be a, clear measurement of where everyone is right now. And what do you say to that? Because Sarah, you had even said in the post that you get to a place sometimes where you're like, oh, am I helping them a little bit too
yeah,
much? And you bring that to Nate. And then Nate, what
yeah.
is your response to that whole idea of like, why would you let them do this during a test? It's a test.
Mhm.
Well, I think that there are different situations and different scenarios to consider, but in the student that we're talking about as well, there's at our school there's a point where you maintain a certain average and you go to from pre-algebra to algebra 1, or you go to algebra concepts, which kind of helps you gain a little bit more confidence in pre-algebra before starting the algebra curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of schools do have those advanced paths or
Yeah.
honors paths or whatever. And so we were to a point in the year where we were pretty confident that it was going to be in this child's best interest to give her a little bit more practice in the pre-algebra stuff before starting algebra. And so it came to a point where it was like, well, why not start building up her confidence now?
Mm-hmm.
She's not gonna move into algebra. She's gonna move into the algebra concepts
Mm-hmm.
course, and that's gonna be right for her regardless. But why not start building up her confidence? Start figuring out where some of those gaps are that we can help when she does move on to the next class, and help her feel good about herself a little bit, and maybe get rid of some of this math anxiety that's there by helping her be successful.
I want to jump on that statement really quick too, because again, I know that some people have a very strong reaction to this idea of like just letting kids feel good about themselves. And you're not talking about just
No.
boosting her up with air. This is actually using the test as an opportunity to have her continue to learn. And Sarah, somewhere in the post, you even mentioned that sometimes it is that pressure of the test that gets the kids at that extra little bit of motivation to try versus when you're just doing like a regular session of learning with them. It's kind of like, I want to go play my video game, but it's like, this is a test. It's important. And you're just using it as a way to do just that little bit of extra instruction. And Nate, to your point, is just sort of like, this isn't going to leap her ahead of other kids who are already very proficient in the math. This is just getting her to not give up and to realize that she does know some stuff.
Right.
Exactly.
No, kids are really dialed in during tests. So like that's also been sort of, I didn't know this going into it, but they're so focused because they want to make a good grade that it's actually kind of the perfect time to then like layer in a strategy or something that would help them because they're more open to trying it when they're in that space. But also, I won't like if a student's taking a test with me and I can tell they absolutely have no clue how to solve this problem, then that's when I have a conversation with them about sometimes you just gotta lose points, like that's where you put the question mark, because I can't reteach this. I can't show you how. I can reteach it to you later, but on the test I can't show you how to do it because that's not you showing Mr. Wolkenhauer that you know how to do it. So I try to kind of teach them where that line is as well. And then I think it's easier, when it comes time to talk about their grade, and we write comments on our report cards, and teachers will write in sometimes that a student is getting better at using support and resources to help themselves do better in this class. And so that's sort of how we can couch it and even talk about it with families so that it's doesn't feel like it's, to me it's not. And I get that, because I get anxious that this teacher's going to think I'm over helping, or
Mm-hmm.
that they're, I'm not treating their test with the integrity that. So I try to kind of really walk that line. And also because I know that the kids need to know it, or they're not going to be successful in their next level of math. I don't want to set them up for failing later.
Yeah.
So
I think this is such a good model of, I don't personally get to sort of peek behind the curtain of what goes on when you have these, sessions with students who have accommodations. They just go off. And if you're a regular classroom teacher, you never really know what's happening.
what's going
And
on?
so
Yeah.
it's really interesting to see how, even though on paper, maybe a lot of times these accommodations look very much the same, that as the specialist, you really are doing a very nuanced decision-making process with each kid, depending on exactly how much do they need. I don't want to do too much. And I don't know. I think it's a very impressive skill set that you have.
Thanks.
And Sarah's the best of the best. Not only is she wonderful with kids, but she's great with communication and with her colleagues. So, I mean, I don't necessarily feel like I send my kids and don't know what's going on, because Sarah will come and talk to me and say, "Hey, this is what we're trying. This is what we did. What are your thoughts?" She's phenomenal.
Well, we trust each other to
Yeah.
make decisions that we feel like are at the sort of bottom line, or the most, what's most important for this kid. And that does take, kind of figuring out what those are. And I think there are teachers that probably would disagree on what those things are.
That also speaks to the importance of the relationship, of putting some effort into the relationship with your co-teacher, though, and actually, building that trust, getting to know each other a little bit, and like actually learning what the other person needs, because that can also be a very, tense relationship. Those relationships can break down all the time. So,
Right.
I think this is a really good model of what it can look like when it's working well. So we're at the top of the tier now, the very top tier. And this is what you are calling strategies for the 10%. So for the kids who, you've done all the other things and they still need a little bit of extra help, we've got just a handful of these. So how about I will just say them to you and you can just describe for them a little bit. So the first section, we've kind of got a little group of them: highlighting, lined paper, and color coding. What does that look like for a student in
Yeah.
math?
When I work with students, some students struggle with the organization of math. So it's not necessarily the concept, but, finding what X is, but just like, how do I keep this all organized on both sides of the equation and line everything up so that it's going to work out right? So it's almost more executive functioning around the math and how to set it up. So we'll work on things like working problems down the page instead of sideways and upside down and all over, where they can't remember where they are within a problem, or color coding, maybe like terms, so they start to see that, oh wait, I can add 2x and 4x, because those are like terms. Sometimes with even just things like angles that they're looking at next to each other, some students just don't see it on a black and white printout, or we use technology a lot too, or even on the screen. But if we can color code the angles that the problem's talking about, then it becomes apparent to them how those angles relate, or shapes, or whatever in geometry. So just using strategies to stay organized and then make those details within problems more visible to students who kind of struggle to catch them, or to organize themselves around the math. Algebra has a lot of directionality, like which way is I get that a lot still, where I'm flipping the X and the Y value, and which goes horizontal and which is up and down. And so anything that kind of helps kids stay organized, whether we color code the X and Y axis for a while until they get the hang of, I go right or left first and then I go up or down, can help.
The second thing you have on this list is manipulatives.
Yeah. So that is just, and I feel like that's pretty well-known
Mm-hmm.
thing that helps some students is it just needs to be a little more tactile and a little more visible. And I'll like just I think most basic examples they learn about surface area and volume, and they're looking at these pictures of 3D figures, but they can't really picture it as a 3D figure unless they see a 3D figure. And then you can really talk about where's the base, like what am I talking about when I say base? But that's really hard to see on a piece of paper.
Yeah.
But it could be anything. I mean, some students too, just the idea of balance in an equation, stuff like that, when you have something tactile that they can play around with to see how that works.
Yeah. And it's hard to imagine that Nate isn't also doing some of that stuff sort of with everybody anyway.
Yeah, a lot of it's built in to, yeah.
Not that it's this restrictive thing. A lot of these are things that
Right.
happen all the time with everybody. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Definitely.
Yeah.
This one was interesting, and we're almost at the end, but this one I thought also was kind of a different one from what I'm seeing in other places. This idea of, I guess, around since Common Core came along, yeah, like we've had this idea of we want kids to understand the depth of the math and that the meaning behind it. So we want them to have multiple ways of solving given
Right.
problems versus the old way that probably a lot of us were brought up on, which is like, this is how you do long division. You don't have to think about
Right.
what it means. Just do this algorithm and you will get an answer. And let's not worry about what it actually means. And so what you talk about in the post is how, yes, with many kids, that approach works. However, with some of these kids at the top of this pyramid who just aren't quite getting that, you are actually opting kind of to go back to the older way of doing
Choose
things.
one way. Yeah.
So what does that look like when you're sort of limiting the options?
It again depends on the kids, and I don't want to offend any math researchers because I think all of it is great. Like it's great that we want American kids to understand the math better. But just some students get to a point where it's like you're trying to teach them 4 different methods and there's only one of them that really makes sense to them. I just sometimes don't have time to teach them these other ones. Like when we have found something that works, let's set every problem up the same way and work on this until you feel confident in this. And then maybe we'll go touch on some of those other ways to solve. But I just think increasing sort of the cognitive overload of you could also do it this way and you could also do it this way, it's too much for them, and that they need a process that works to get them to the right answer. And I hate saying that because it's not all about that, but it's sometimes students that again need some confidence and need to kind of keep working and building skills, and they're often the kids that are like, I just need to survive math, I don't want to be an engineer, I will never take a math class again after this. So
it sounds like if it's a choice between doing that or just having them shut down and fail the class and not do any math, then that is a way better choice, especially if for some of them it kind of gets them eventually to be able to take on even more of those options. But without that confidence, they can't go anywhere.
I think there's a difference too between mastering and, for a kid that works on that one strategy and masters it and does really well with it, as opposed to let's get okay at 4 different strategies.
4 different things.
Even as the math teacher, I think we'd rather them master one of those or get really good at one of those strategies, and then that'll help connect the dots with some of the others as well.
The very last piece is just talking about calculators, and that is another thing that are kids not allowed to use calculators in general, or are you saying that they get to use them more? Some of these kids are getting to use them more than everybody else.
Sometimes I think I mean, for the most part, we all have them in our pockets, and I think kids should get to use them for that reason. But I think they're also, especially when you start middle school, just sort of trying to work on kids' fluency with math. And some kids are just not, the automatic math facts are like, irregular spelling words. It's just not that's not how their brain works. They can't memorize. They're very rote to them. or they just don't see the relationship between numbers. They describe dyscalculia as being sort of like people who don't just have a strong internal number line, like they can't evaluate quantity in the same way. So why not just, it doesn't mean they're not capable of the problem solving and the reasoning and the sort of all the work that you do to solve a problem. It's more just like, can they use a calculator to remember that? And sometimes it's simple, like 4 divided by anything divided by 1 is going to be itself. It's just they have to plug it in and see it again and again and again to know that that's what the answer is going to be.
Yeah.
Where sometimes we think, oh, kids should have their math facts down and go back and study them. I think for some kids, it's not a matter of how much they've tried to skill and drill those math facts. Yeah. It's just not what their brain holds on to. So can they use a calculator to support their calculation and then be able to move into higher levels of math?
It sounds like if a kid is lucky enough to be placed with the two of you, they stand a better chance at doing well at math and becoming kind of a math person when maybe they never were before. Then, I think it's a real stroke of luck for them to end up with you guys. Thank you so much. I know that this is an incredibly busy time of year for both of you. And so I really appreciate you taking the time to write the post and do this. And, we'll see what people have to say. I think it's going to help a lot of people out.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Yeah, really. Thank you for now.
Thank you. To read Nate and Sarah's post, visit cultofpedagogy.com, click podcast, and choose episode 229. To get a bi-monthly email from me about my newest blog posts, podcast episodes, courses, and products, sign up for my mailing list at cultofpedagogy.com/subscribe. Thanks so much for listening and have a great day.